general theme course on the American Dream. So
You know what that is,
combination
actually? I
of
once did a Diaz, but he remembers when the phrase first came in the 20s or slightly earlier, and it was an advertising slogan for a car in every garage.
Right.
It was the American dream was to have a car in every garage or two, and that was the original genesis of that phrase.
An ad man.
That's very interesting. It's a very interesting piece of historicism.
Yeah, I actually teach the course from the 20. Could I just ask you first to tell us something about what you've been doing in Trondheim and Norway and the other bits, other places that we should be visiting on this tour?
Well, I started in Vienna on September 7th with the poet Anne Waldman and the Austrian poet H.C. Arfmann and the sound poet, what's his name? Ernst Jandl. Teaching at a Schule für Dichtung, school for poetry, modeled on the Europa Institute in Boulder, that was begun with city finances from Vienna by some ex-students of Naropa's Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics. And they asked me to come and teach for 2 weeks. And then I drove with my Hungarian translator, poet, playwright friend, István Ersi, to Budapest, where I'd been several times before. And he has a big, huge apartment overlooking the whole panorama of Buda and Pest. So we spent a week there doing some shows with Hobo Blues Band, because we put out a record in '86 that sold quite a few copies of singing blues and howl. So I had some money there waiting for me. And then on a chance, we decided we'd go to Novi Sad in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, Serbia, and pass the blockade. Because we were invited by friends of Istvan, who were playwrights, and he had just been to Sarajevo under UN auspices. And what we found is that the majority of the people in Belgrade were against the war and had voted against it, because they have alternative TV and alternative weekly newspapers that are anti-government, but the government has a monopoly on the TV that goes into the peasant countryside, and so that's how the government survives, with a monopoly of TV, brainwashing, propaganda, everybody. So everybody said that the cultural blockade of Belgrade was a huge mistake that was prolonging the war and killing people, because the only way to overthrow the government was some kind of a cultural blitzkrieg, you know, and what they said was what was necessary is not bombing, but a mind bomb, you know, into the countryside, some sort of pamphlets, deep dish TV or whatever, anything to communicate to the peasants what the score is, the pictures and everything. So they asked me to say that when I got out, and also asked me to ask Dylan to come to Yugoslavia, despite the cultural blockade. It would have been like blockading Czechoslovakia during the Velvet Revolution, or Poland during Solidarity. You know, the students are cut off from news from the outside, from communication, enthusiasm, help, encouragement, student strikes, or anything. They had a big student strike last year. It lasted 2 months, blown up by tear gas finally, and it was not hardly reported in the West. The West just gave up on them, and so they're all feeling paranoid. Both the war Serbians and the anti-war Serbians feel that the West has sort of betrayed them. Then I went to Poland on train from Budapest to Krakow. I had a new book out and saw a lot of old friends, because I'd been there twice before. And went to, from Krakow to beautiful symphony hall, the Pomeranian Symphony Hall in Bydgoszcz, which holds 1,000 people, and is the greatest acoustics in Central Europe. Arthur Rubinstein, the pianist, used to be there, and had a big reading with a couple of translators, and a full house, about 800-900 people. Then went up to Łódź, L-O-D-Z, and went to the old factories owned by the old Jewish families, and and the houses that they had, which were turned into museums, and went to the Jewish cemetery, because 200,000 Jews were killed there. 50,000 starved to death by the Nazis at the beginning of the war in Łódź, and then 150,000 sent to Buchenwald and Dachau. So an old survivor, 72 years old, who had been in the ghetto, been in Buchenwald, been sent to Dachau, and had returned, told me the story and took me to the synagogue. And there was this little tiny synagogue that had a new, freshly painted brown door, tin door. Already some kids had scrawled swastikas and Judenraus in there. Then went to Katowice, a small town, which was fun, with a Buddhist group, and then Warsaw with another Buddhist group to give readings, and saw some old friends, some old writers that I knew from years back. And then went to Cheltenham Festival outside London, then to Dublin on a visit arranged by a singer named Gavin Friday. You know him at all? Very nice. I'd met him in America. And he's a friend of Marion Faithfull, who lives there, and of my producer, Hal Wilner, who produces the Burroughs records. And he had heard a record that I did for Island called The Lion for Real. And Bono and Edge had heard that too years ago and liked it. So they all came to my reading and arranged a reading for me. In quite a big hall, the Union Hall there, about 700-800 people. Then I went up to Belfast and gave a reading there, and then took a taxi to the Peace Wall, or the Peace Line, which gray, brown tanks and armored cars to keep people from murdering each other, British soldiers. They came back to Dublin, and Gavin and Bono asked me to go into a TV studio to do Don't Smoke and Humbam in time to sort of, one of their tunes, I don't know what, for a TV spectacular that they're going to be putting out on 3 different channels at once in America and Europe. And so, while they have the same soundtrack on each, they'll also have my soundtrack on one of the channels, doing it in the same time as their song.
Do you see the future of poetry as being much more interconnected with other media?
Not particularly. The media may be getting more interconnected with poetry. Poetry's been there longer than the media, and it'll be there a lot longer. Poetry is the original media. The other media, you can pull out a plug and you ain't got nothing, like you found today. You can lock your media in your car, or you can put a pencil and paper or a piece of graphite and rock or eternal.
Does poetry still have the capacity to shout and howl, though, above the other noise of information, which is continuing?
No, I did a little bit of shouting today. Humbam, Don't Smoke, Kaddish. What do you mean? Poetry is not a person. Do certain people have the ability to lift their voices in elation or in exuberance? Exuberance is beauty, Blake says. I think that's a foolish question. It's like, 700 AD, does poetry still have the ability to lift its voice and make noise? 1200 AD, 1500 AD.
Sure.
Ask Mr. Shakespeare. I don't know. Ask Handel,
Yes.
who wrote the Messiah. Ask Beethoven's Ode to Joy. I don't know why. It's a foolish question.
You referred to yourself in one of your poems as a senior citizen.
Well, I'm 67 years old.
Undoubtedly.
You get to be a senior citizen at 62 in America, and 55 in some of the Eastern countries. You can retire.
Undoubtedly, you're one of the most senior citizens within the world of poetry.
No, there's lots of older poets. There's a great old poet named Karl Rakosi, who's now 89, who's coming to teach, who taught this last year at Naropa. I gave a reading with him. Karl Rakosi, one of the last surviving members of the group of objectivists. Bunting, Williams, Charles Reznikoff, George Uppen, that group. The senior poets from the 30s and 40s.
I mean, Basil Bunton still is very much neglected.
He's got a book out in Oxford, and people know about him now. When I met him in 1965, he didn't have any books. And when I first read him in 1950, he had only one book put out in Texas in the Square Dollar series like thing that Pound used to promote, like a little paperback. It cost $1, and now it's worth a couple $100. I bought 2 copies. Gary Snyder had read him in the 50s, and Philip Whalen, the other poets. We all knew about him.
Are they new, younger poets whose voices particularly
I think so.
attract you?
Well, younger than me, Dylan, Ann Waldman, they're about the same age, Ted Berrigan, Ron Padgett, and many poets, actually. Then younger than that, you got Patti Smith and a whole bunch of other poets. But the ones I particularly like are not so well known in England or here. One is called Antler, A-N-T-L-E-R, who had a book called Factory, out of print, City Lights. And another poet, David Cope, who writes in the tradition of Williams and Resnikoff, very straightforward pieces, pictorial. He lives in Michigan. He's published by Humana Press in New Jersey. Andy Clausen, who's a hod carrier working man poet, who I like and Philip Whalen likes. And there's a 21-year-old David Greenberg, whose work I like a lot. Elliot Katz, who's about 35, social poet. Long Whitmanic lines. Eileen Miles, she's about 35 too, getting on toward 40, around New York. Tim Glugos, who died of AIDS, wrote a beautiful series of poems in the hospital, Ward 8. Just lots of poets. It's a very healthy scene. Then you count all the other poets that are working with rock and roll, you know, like Lee Ronaldo and all the Sonic Youth fellows.
Perhaps I could...
I'm working with them now. They asked me for a tape, and I gave them a tape. They worked with Burroughs on Burroughs' last record. And Disposable Heroes of Hypocrisy are working, just finished another record with them.
And perhaps I could close with a more general question.
Yep.
The beat poets and writers were always very upbeat, always very optimistic.
Not necessarily. I wouldn't call Burroughs very optimistic. Kerouac was not so much optimistic as passionate and sad.
Well, let's say that you yourself were possibly the most cheerful.
Maybe Gregory Corso the most cheerful.
One of the most cheerful.
He said, "Day and night, I'm all right," unquote.
I was just wondering what
I think you shouldn't. You shouldn't be so. You stereotype people like that. I mean, all the poets were different, totally different. Peter Orlovsky was very optimistic and farmer, relatively unlettered, but a tremendous lyric heart. And Gregory is maybe, though formerly uneducated, he's the greatest commander of the classics of anybody, Greek and Latin mythologies. Burroughs has a kind of black humor that's, I wouldn't say optimistic at all. So what's the cause of any optimism? Is the fact that everybody's going to die anyway, so what difference does it make? So whatever you can do to relieve the suffering of the situation of being born in a body where there's going to be some problem later on, get used to your body, forget you were born, suddenly you got to get out.
So you kind of answered my question, because I wanted to know why you yourself personally were able to remain so cheerful.
Well, so lots of people remain cheerful. Gregory's quite cheerful. Burroughs is cheerful despite his black humor. I think most people are pretty cheerful.
Don't you think
those who write and do something,
what's next?
Those people who write and create something are generally pretty well balanced and cheerful.
Is the New World Disorder not a cause for pessimism?
Well, you're going to die anyway, so what is a New World Disorder? What are you complaining? It's the universe. Is the universe the cause of
sooner or later?
Listen, I've had a good time. I'll continue to have a good time, and I don't think there's going to be an explosion. I think there'll be a gridlock. We might lose the planet, but it'll take 100, 200 years. And a gridlock rather than a big bang, given the use of fossil fuel and overpopulation, and the general aggression that people display. from Ireland or Serbia or Croatia or Bosnia or Tamil Nadu or wherever you want to look. Black and white in America, brown against black in America, white against everybody. It's pretty...
You're getting pessimistic.
No, those people are in trouble. Why do you reduce everything to stereotypes? It's a question. Why must you reduce everything to optimistic, pessimistic? Is that the only categories we can live with?
It's a question.
Well, I would say that the question is a semantic problem. That reality is much more various and ample than optimistic or pessimistic. For myself, I don't believe in hope or fear. I think they're coupled. The more you hope, the more you fear. And it'd be better just to be, like Burroughs says, a factualist. Not cling to false hope and not cling to false fear. Sentimental fear. Sentimental hope. In energy is eternal delight. Exuberance is beauty, says Blake. So there's natural exuberance. Then meditation practice helps. Clear the mind of accumulated, solidified stereotypes. And the very nature of creation in writing has as its fruition self-enlightenment and the enlightenment of others and communication, and that's always a gladdening thing. As the audience was gladdened tonight, and as I was gladdened to be able to serve that.
Thanks very much. That's
okay.
Great.
I just wonder if in your own poetry, if you were influenced by Louis Ferdinand Céline.
Very much, yeah.
Very much.
Sure.
Was he a cheerful person?
Well, actually, his work is very funny. If you, you know, it's amazingly, like Burroughs.
Yeah.
Kerouac and Burroughs were both influenced by Céline, as prose writers more than me. But you know, Burroughs and I went to visit Céline.
Yeah, I read about that.
Yeah, and Burroughs gave me a copy of Journey to the End of the Night in Kerouac back in 1945. First English translations that they were around, and I was partly instrumental in having later works published, like D'un Château à l'autre, From Castle to Castle, and Nord. And I always thought he was very funny. It's a mixture, you know. When we visited him, he was kind of, he had this sour, gloomy look, but he was making all sorts of funny jokes and remarks.
Was he a doctor then?
Yeah, he said, asked him if he had a practice. Said, yeah, not much of a practice, just some old people that used to go to him. But then he said 90% of medical practice is young girls who want to take their clothes off in front of a young guy. It was funny around the world that people read when they're 12 or 13 years old, the first adult author. And he's the one that creates that first sense of paranoia,
the first meeting?
Huh?
The first meeting with paranoia?
Well, literally.
Yeah.
You know, Kafka comes out of Poe.
Yeah.
Gogol. It's a question of if you think like the telltale heart about a guy who murders somebody and then he hears the heart beating and goes nuts, conscience, and also a planetary view of the descent into the maelstrom. You get the whole view of the planet, as well as with a story called The Mask of the Red Death. You get AIDS or nuclear world catastrophe. Very interesting. And it's all in pursuit of beauty rather than politics. Yet he has more to do with individuating people and making them self-realized than any other writer, because he hits them younger, from China to America. Surprised you hadn't read him before. Well, I guess that's it.